Hello and welcome to this week's Q&As. Before I begin, I just want to give a quick update on the support services. It looks like Bitbacker shut down. I think they were changing their names, but now no one can log back in. So I don't really trust that platform at all anymore. I think I'm going to just walk away from that one. I'm not sure how many people were subscribed there, but it wasn't very many. So my apologies to any of you, but you can't even get to Bitbacker anymore. So there's nothing I could do about that. And Subscribestar has been okay, but I think for the future, I really want to concentrate on Floatplane and Patreon. I know that's contrary to things I've always said. I always said I wanted to sign up for all of them so that I'm not forcing people to use certain services. It's just I kind of lost all faith in anything that has to do with Bitbacker, and Subscribestar has always kind of been on the fence. You know, you don't get any support through them. You can't really contact anybody there. So, or maybe that was just my experience and everybody else had it well, or had it done right. But for me, I think it's best to just concentrate on those two. For the short term, YouTube shouldn't change, but I'm not sure how that's going to factor into any of the changes that are about to happen to Retro RGB, which is something I'm going to talk a lot more about, and hopefully give all of you the exclusive scoop on it as soon as everything's finalized. But throughout 2020, there's going to be some pretty huge changes to Retro RGB. For the short term, that means nothing for all of you. I mean that in a good way, of course. Just the support services, what I do, how I interact, all going to stay the same. But throughout the rest of the year, Retro RGB will be going through some pretty awesome changes. And I don't know where YouTube factors into that, but that's more of a long-term thing, not a short-term thing. So I'll continue to give updates on the changes throughout the website as soon as everything's nailed down and decided upon. There's a couple of different things we're just waiting on before we make any final decisions, but they're all exciting, at least to me. So anyway, thank you all for your support. I'm so sorry for the inconvenience for anybody that's on Bitbacker or Subscribestar, but as far as I know, Bitbacker is just done, and I'm going to move away from Subscribestar by the end of April before you get charged for that April payment. So that way I don't sneak up on anybody or anything like that. So sorry for the inconvenience, but let's jump into the Q&As. First up, what might be our last question on Subscribestar. The importer said, while I love the Famicom style case that Mr. Add-ons made, I would love a more consoleized style casing. I'd like to have something that looks like a modern console with, and then the importer lists a bunch of pretty cool features like Wi-Fi, Ethernet, all that stuff. Do I know anybody working on such a project? So a bunch of people have mentioned that they were going to try to work on things like that. But there's a lot of things involved. Like if you need to make a new piece of hardware, you either need to make it using the exact same parts that just fits different, or then you would need to try to add the software code into Mister to talk to whatever new I/O device that you made. So you would have to be both a hardware and software engineer to pull off that part of it. So the short answer to your question is I don't know of anything in the short term, but it would be really cool to see stuff like that, or even bigger scope projects involving Mister and basically any open source FPGA stuff. So I'll keep people posted if I ever hear anything of something solid. Over on Patreon, Dave Sobel said their system is all RGB based with a pair of Scart switch units handling everything to the OSSC and PVM. They have a modded Atari 2600, but own a 7800, which has no available RGB mod. With the new state of devices, such as a larger selection of RetroTink units, they're considering swapping the 7800 for the 2600 to get both systems in one and keep space manageable. What would be the optimal way to connect that system into the Rgb setup? Well, assuming that you have one of the basic mods done for the 7800, the S-Video or Composite, my opinion based on the testing that I did was that you should get the CoreU transcoder, go S-Video into that, and then from there into the Scart. The only problem, though, is what version of the Scart do you have? If you have the newest one that's just called Scart Switch, or if you have the older one with the VGA-style output, you could run through all of that, and then when it switches from RGB to component video, which the CoreU outputs, then you could set that into, you would just have to change your OSSC to component video mode, and then change the OSSC back to RGB mode once the Scart switch goes back to a different device. But the only problems with that, as well as the problems of using something like the RetroTink 2X to go from S-Video to RGB, if you will, is I think those devices will always output a signal, making it hard to have automated systems in there. So, if you have a G-Scart switch with 7 things plugged into it, plus this, it'll always go to this, because unless you physically turn off the Core U or any of the conversion devices for the RetroTink, then it would switch over automatically. So it's kind of a confusing setup, but that's basically what you would have to do. Is if you have a G-Scart that could pass through component video, then just simply turn on the Core U with the Atari 7800, and that will take care of the automation. So then you would want to keep the Core U as close to the 7800 as possible, just to make all this stuff easier. And then if you didn't want to go the component video route, which is the only thing the Core U outputs, the other thing that you can do, you're just going to need either some extra equipment, or you're going to need a little bit more knowledge. But you could take a RetroTink 2X and go into an HDMI to VGA converter, and then go from an RGB HV to an RGBS sync combiner. So that's something like a cheap Extron unit that you could find on eBay for fairly cheap these days, $20, maybe a little more if you need a power supply. You could try to find a sync combiner that's out there. You could make your own. If you read Steve from HD Retrovision did a whole thing on sync and sync combining and the proper way to make these circuits. So if you wanted to just stay full RGB, you could use S-Video into a RetroTink to an HDMI to VGA converter, and then convert that from RGB HV to RGBS. You could make your own Y cable. It's as simple as that. But if you use an Extron device, you might be able to just power that on and off every time your console's powered on. So that way, maybe hook up your 7800, the RetroTink 2X, and the converter and the Extron all to one little power switch, and flip that power switch on when you need to switch over to the 7800. Now, that's obviously a lot of equipment and a giant pain for one console. However, if you ever add any other composite or S-Video devices, you could just put them all behind that as one solution. So I really wish there was a passive S-Video to RGB converter out there that we could just use, but it's something that the retro gaming scene has struggled with for years, and the Core U and the Tink Plus converter are really the only devices out there that are designed for this reason by the retro gaming community that you could just go buy. There's some other stuff you could find on eBay, but it's pretty expensive and kind of a giant pain. So sorry for the long drawn out response, but there is no 1, 2, 3 answer to this. It is kind of just everything that I explained. Dr. Mookows said after many months of patience and vigilance checking local game stores, they took a chance on purchasing a SNES that was possibly a one-chip, and it was. After opening the case, they confirmed it's a one-chip 03, and additional reading on the site says that this version doesn't support C-Sync to the multi-out. Correct. The question is, do the suggested modifications to enable C-Sync need to be done in my scenarios where I'm using an HD Retrovision component cable to either a consumer CRT or an OSSC? It's not clear to me from reading, and I want to be sure before using it and potentially causing some damage. So in that scenario that you talked about, connecting C-Sync is totally useless. You don't need to do that at all. And if for whatever reason you ever wanted to use an RGB Scart cable, you could just get a good shielded one and just get one that syncs on composite video, and also never need to have C-Sync. Without going on a long C-Sync rant, the reason that my personal consoles are all getting direct C-Sync output is for ease of use depending on what equipment you're using. So Extron crosspoints, some monitors, some capture cards. There's going to be issues if you use composite video as sync, but if you're using the HD Retrovision cables, or if you're going into an open source scan converter, this is not an issue in the slightest, and you have nothing to worry about. So yeah, just proceed as usual, and it's a perfectly good solution that you don't have to worry about. One more from Dr. Mookows. They're on a quest to get rid of any need for the Retron 5 in their house. Congratulations, good choice. I'm sure it was great to start out and get you to decide whether this was a fun hobby or a serious hobby. So Retron 5 certainly had its place, but glad you're moving on. And the question is, they need a hardware alternative for playing everything, including PAL region games, and they currently only have NTSC consoles. So what options do they have for playing PAL games? Depending on the console and depending on the mod, if you use a ROM cart, you could just try it and see what happens. Probably not it won't hurt anything, but it probably won't do much good. Almost all of these consoles have some kind of option to allow for multi-region on the same console. If you do your own mods, it's something that you should look into. But I think the overall cost of buying the parts for what's needed for the mod and paying a modder to do them is actually more than what it would cost in most of these cases to just order a PAL console from overseas and use it that way. ROM carts would definitely work because then, you might, unlike on a NES, you might have to boot it a couple times before it switches over to a different mode or something, but that would totally take care of it. The only other problem, which you already mentioned, is what would you do for converting the power supplies? And my very strong suggestion is just to go to Firebrand X's website, and I think he links to a thread on Shmups, which is the best replacement PSUs for older consoles. And rather than worrying about step up or step down and worrying about 30-year-old power supplies, just grab one of the triads and any of the necessary pigtails so that you could just use a brand new NTSC power supply on that console and it should work perfectly. You don't have to worry about power damage. You don't have to worry about games or anything like that. So it's really just something you're going to want to look into and decide what's best for your situation. I know a lot of people would rather have both consoles but don't have the space for it, don't want to deal with it. Or some people just the opposite. Like they'd rather just have a full setup with triad power supplies and everything like that, and you could go from there. I probably should be triple checking this, but I'm 99% sure that for most consoles, if you use like an NTSC Sega Genesis power supply on a PAL Sega Genesis, as long as they're both Model 1s, that should work as well. So for many people's setups, whether you're using brand new power supplies or the originals, if you're just, every time you're going from NTSC to PAL, you unplug the RGB cable and power, swap out the console and plug this back in, that would be a solution as well. So I just suggest kind of taking a step back and deciding what's best for you and choosing one of those. Joseph Vessel said they have an HD TV with a VGA input, but it's labeled RGB. Is this useful in any way for retro gamers? No. So in all of the years I've been running Retro RGB, every time I see a modern flat panel with a VGA connector, it says RGB on it, and I have no idea why. I think it's one of those things that one company did it once and everybody else just did it and never asked. I don't know if there was ever a reason for it. It should have been VGA the whole time. But in all of the monitors that I've tested, hoping that maybe someday I'll stumble across one, there's only been one. And it was a digital signage monitor. A Patreon subscriber was actually talking with me about, so we were trying to figure out lag tests and all that stuff on it. So, it's got to be 100 monitors and TVs by now over the past 10 years that I've talked to people about, tested myself, and one out of all of them was able to accept an RGBS retro gaming signal, and the rest of them were just simply a VGA input that required both RGB HV and 480p to work. It will not work with RGB without a converter, and at that point you might as well just get a Retro Tank or a 2X Scart or something, because you're just going to have to convert it to a signal the TV understands anyway. So, good question. Don't know why it's labeled wrong, but you could try it and it probably won't hurt, but you're looking at less than 1% of a chance of it actually working. So, sorry, I don't have some cool secret way to get retro consoles in the flat screens. It's just kind of the way it is. ABO Hiccups wanted to know if a Dreamcast with an Acura or Gecko HDMI box would work through a Monoprice 8x1 switch with an M Classic connected to the HDMI output of the switch itself. I've tried that with other HDMI switchers that have HDMI 2.0 ports, and the screen keeps flickering when showing a Sega Dreamcast screen. They tested another HDMI switch that has HDMI 1.4, and it has no issues at all. So that's honestly a question that might differ in everybody's scenario. I think, especially with a lot of these products like a Monoprice 8x1 switch, you never know if they're going to change the motherboard or chip revision of the board that's inside. So while Monoprice has generally been a little more consistent than others, there's no way to tell if the one that I buy on Amazon will have the exact same chips as the one that you have. So that's just something that I'd want to test. The M Classic has some compatibility issues with the OSSC, so I'm not sure how it's going to react with the Dreamcast. But to be honest, that's just something that you're going to have to test and kind of hope that it works. I know that's terrible advice to give. Hopefully the Amazon seller would accept returns if it doesn't work. But that's just a very niche thing. And it could very well work too, that setup that you just described will work with your Dreamcast through the Akura or Gecko or either of the Behar Brothers boxes, but won't work with the OSSC, but will work with this, but won't work with that. So unfortunately, that's a little bit too specific for me to give you a good solution for it unless I'd tested it myself. And once again, even if I did, there's no way to tell if we have the same switch. So sorry, it was a completely useless answer. Seraphil has a question that I'm going to need a few more details in order to give you the best answer, but I'm going to do as best I can with the info I have. So they have a setup that includes a G-Scart switch and a G-Comp switch, and their target devices are a Sony PVM, a consumer-grade Toshiba TV via the component input, and an OSSC. And the goal is to have the same image displayed on all three screens simultaneously and fully automated. So the two major things. First of all, does your RGB monitor support component input? Most Sony PVMs do, a few occasionally do not. So that's the first thing. And second, are they close to each other in the setup? Meaning, are they on the same wall, in the same room, or are they in, totally separate areas? If they are close and if the monitor does accept component, I would suggest all RGB devices into the G-Scart switch, G-Scart switch outputting to the RGB to comp, the RetroTink device, go from there into the G-Comp switch, and then from there, one output to the OSSC and the other output to your Sony PVM's inputs, and then just run RCA cables via BNC to RCA adapters from the outputs of your PVM to the input of your Toshiba consumer grade TV. All three could be on at the same time. It'd be fully automated. There should be zero signal degradation, but I would suggest getting the HD Retrovision cables to connect the RGB to comp to the G-Comp switch, and a really good SCART cable to connect those. We're still, coronavirus kind of delayed all shipments from China, but we're still working on that SCART coupler, which would probably be the best way to connect the RGB to comp to the G-SCART switch, because you would just plug it into the SCART adapter, plug that right into it, no cables. Just make sure you have good cable management so it's not putting strain and yanking on any of the connectors. But that would be the easiest solution, and that would do exactly what you needed it to do. If your PVM doesn't accept component video, then that would be a little bit challenging, and you might need to do two conversions. You might need to then do the exact opposite. So component video through the comp to RGB into the G-SCART, that into your PVM, and the output of the PVM through just a custom cable, a BNC to SCART. You can get them switchable from retro gaming cables, but then you would go BNC to SCART and then do the opposite, go from RGB to component into the Toshiba TV. And now that's two converters, and that would work, but anytime you have an analog signal, the least amount of devices between them, the better. So while that would also be a perfectly good solution, I'd like to save you the extra money for that one device and the extra cables and all that stuff. So I think I got what it was that you were trying to accomplish, but please let me know if I need to follow up on that. Michael Vu had a few questions. I'm going to answer them out of order just because I think it'll be easier. First, do I know if Insurrection Industries plans on making more Saturn SCART cables? I believe so. I don't think they planned on discontinuing them at all. I just think everybody's been getting delays with coronavirus lately. And next, are there any other SCART cables worth buying that have popped up in recent times? So the only cables that I confidently talk about people buying are retro gaming cables, retro access, Insurrection, of course, and HD Retrovision. I have occasionally seen people hand making cables that are excellent, but I don't feel comfortable recommending them because, it's I don't want to say easy, but it's reasonable to expect somebody to make a handful of super high quality cables. But when it comes to hand making cables, it's so easy to make a mistake. It's so easy to not be able to keep up with demand. And I haven't seen any companies step up and make these in quantity. I think Retro Access has kind of gone the opposite way in a positive way, in that they're concentrating more on the handmade stuff, but they're also going out of their way to make sure it's as good as humanly possible. So I think at the moment, those are the companies that I would recommend. If I'm missing anybody, please let me know. But if it's somebody that like sells 2 cables a month on eBay, I have a lot of respect for that, and I always speak nicely of them. But it's not something I would add links to the website, because I don't want to send, hundreds, if not thousands of people to them to go buy something that they're only really set up to build one a day of. Hope that came across the right way. I'm certainly not looking down upon handmade anything. Just got to kind of be reasonable. And lastly, Michael wanted to know about OSSC compatibility with capture cards at 3x or 4x. So that's tricky as well. I've had much more positive compatibility with 2x and 3x than 4 or 5. But there have been times where if you set it to 4x, that and especially if you have something like the Firebrand X profiles that outputs as close to a real 1080p signal as possible, regardless of how much it's stretched inside of that 1080p signal, that does have more compatibility. But overall, I just expect to have spotty compatibility with the open source scan converter. Look for capture cards like the one from my video, the one from Cosmic Katamari's post last week, and just try to pick the most cost-effective compatible solution. So that cheap one that Voltar originally found, that's cheap and it works totally fine, but there's a bunch of things about that where if you're making comparison videos, like, with the side-by-side comparisons, or if you need to output a resolution that's not 1080p, that's not the device for you. And on the other side of things, you could go buy a brand new data path for $800 and, that'll do everything, but that's $800. Of course, I would suggest buying a used one for like $150 on eBay, but just wanted to cover the gamut there. So, yes, there's more compatibility at 3x. There's a little bit more at 4x than 5x, but depending on your TV, 3x could look really good. And, if you're going into 4K, 3x into 4K is 9x. So you would actually end up, with the exact look somebody would want in that scenario. It would be nicer if it was integer scaled, so it's a little sharper for the retro. But, I would just, I would give whatever capture card you already have a try. And if not, then check out the 2 things I mentioned, my video and Cosmic Katamari's article, and buy one of those. Bo Lee just picked up a Neo Geo AES and wants to know if I have any suggestions for mods other than the simple bypass mod that's listed on Retro RGB. A few thoughts on that. First, make sure your motherboard revision's the same, and if not, you're going to have to probably do a little bit of double checking, because the purpose of that mod is to bypass the Sony CXA encoder. So the Neo Geo has its own digital to analog converter that changes it from ones to zeros to analog video, and it's the same pretty much as the arcade boards. But on the AES, that's run through a Sony CXA chip that also gets you composite video and does a few other things. So that bypass mod that's listed on there just goes directly from the original digital to analog converter, puts it through the correct resistors to make sure you have the right voltage and brightness, and then sends it directly to the output, bypassing all of that. So you're bypassing the circuit, you're bypassing the chip, and you're also bypassing the motherboard. So any inherent interference that might have been radiating through the board is kind of skipped. So if your model doesn't match, you have to make sure that you tap the correct RGBS points, and it might be worth double checking the voltages if you have access to an oscilloscope. If it's the same exact model, just follow it exactly. The only other mods I recommend doing is checking and possibly replacing the capacitors. But that's kind of a chicken and the egg scenario, in that if you open up your AES now and you look at the board very carefully and you say, none of the capacitors are leaking, I'm good. And you open it 6 months from now, same thing. And you open it 6 months from then and one of the capacitors has leaked. What would have been the right thing to do? Replace all the caps now, knowing you probably would have had another year out of them, or wait till there's potentially some damage on your motherboard? It's my personal opinion that I just replace them now. If I have the time to do it, Console 5 has the kits, I just do it. It's a pain. Some people love doing it, some people don't. I would rather be making videos or doing other stuff, but it's a preventative maintenance where now you don't have to worry about your capacitors for 10 years. You don't have to open that up once a year to double check. You could just proceed and enjoy your console. As far as other stuff listed, there's a bunch of things in the works that'll probably be out by the end of 2020, but that won't affect the cap replacement. You're going to have to do that no matter what if you're looking to do that kind of maintenance. And it's not really going to affect the simple bypass mod either. You might need to undo that, but we're talking, four resistors or something? So, I would say proceed with those two, cap replacement and the simple bypass, and go from there. Frank Aguayo is in the process of building a retro setup and have purchased items that they have no idea why they own them. I totally know the feeling. They figured out the HDMI to component video is for RetroTink to OSSC. And they also have an Extron RXI and don't remember exactly what they picked it up for. So the Extron RXI boxes convert between RGB HV and RGBS. So that's a sync combiner box. Depending on which model you have, some could also act as VGA style switches, and some might even have dual output, but generally speaking, you would buy an RXI box. It's one of those things that I recommend any tinkerer that's going to have a setup that's not so straightforward. You might be integrating multiple things into it. Just watch eBay for one, pick up the cheapest RXI you could find, and there you go. Now you have your sync combiner or sync splitter or whatever you need. But it's, depending on your setup, you might not need it at all. Just leave it on a shelf and hold on to it. Do I know much about the GBS control project? No, but I'm learning, and I'm going to be doing a video on that. I just have to catch up with all the stuff. I still have videos in progress from when I was sick. I still have a bunch of updates I'm working on for the website, plus a million things in between. So I will get to that. The short version is I hear you could take these $20 GBS converters that by themselves, if you just buy it and plug it in, kind of aren't very good. But if you flash it with custom firmware that was written by members of the retro gaming community, they make a pretty darn good converter. So I will definitely check into that, measure the lag, see how they compare to the RetroTink. And but as far as I know, the GBS is a device for somebody that's either really enjoys tinkering and flashing with firmware, flashing new firmware, making new things happen, or somebody that's on a strict budget, but it's not for a straightforward setup. And lastly, my setup is consoles with C-Sync to a G-Scart, then to a crosspoint for both RGB and I'm assuming you meant RGB and VGA switching or RGB and component switching. Also have a DVDO Duo to go to, then finally a 1080p TV. So that's an interesting setup. I'm assuming you're thinking of a DVDO to normalize the OSSC's sound or OSSC's video output. That one's kind of interesting. But the last part, heard different things about sync from a crosspoint to OSSC. Don't want to fry anything. Suggestions on dip switch settings or special cables. So that's an easy question, or that's an easy answer to that question. Get a BNC to SCART cable that has the proper resistor on the sync line of the SCART cable. Otherwise, yes, you'll be sending too much voltage to the OSSC and you could blow that out. That's one of those things that it's not just, your device will last 19 and a half years, not 20. Like that one that might fry it right away. It's definitely not designed for high voltage sync signals through the SCART port. So you could also just go into the VGA port, but then you don't have the advantage of the low pass filter. So it's really the best thing to do is get the BNC to SCART cable with the resistor on the SCART line to drop the voltage. And once again, that's not converting RGB HV. It's just converting RGBS with a high voltage to RGBS with the lower video voltage on the sync line. So I think that covers it. Let me know if I missed the purpose of the DVDO Duo, because that sounds interesting, but I think I was able to kind of lay everything else out for you. Well, that's it for this week. If you're new to these Q&As, please ask any questions at all that you have. Just please do it in the newest Q&A video, wherever it is that you support. The way these services work, it's almost impossible for me to go back to previous weeks and figure out what's a new comment or not. There isn't like a general comment window I could look in, so please just post wherever the newest Q&A video is. Post your question right there, and if for whatever reason I miss it, it's almost always a mistake, so please just re-ask it or something. Maybe the question came in after I already recorded or something like that. And also, I do leave the comments on the YouTube videos for algorithm purposes, but these videos are a thank you to everybody who supports. Absolutely no disrespect, but I do not read the YouTube comments on these videos. I do on all the other ones, and I've responded to thousands and thousands of people over the years on YouTube, just not on these. These videos are really just a thank you and a celebration of everybody that supports, because your support makes so much happen behind the scenes. You're keeping the website running, keeping the weekly podcast going. So thank you all very, very much for all of that. And I will see you next week.